Hey everyone! Hey everyone out there in the big wide world. My name is Bryant Francis. I am down here in the bottom left-hand corner for once. I am a contributing editor at Gamasutra.com, and we are thrilled to have you all here today because we have some wonderful guests here to talk about a very wonderful subject. In order, Tara, Stephen, and James, could you please introduce yourselves?
Hello, well, I am Tara Velker. I've been working in video games since, I don't know, the dawn of time. It's been about 9 years now. And I've worked on a whole bunch of different projects. I'm currently at PlayStation working on PlayStation Now, but I've been in the game accessibility field for about 8 years. But I actually started way back in the day with Able Gamers, which I think transitions it nicely to Steve.
That's right. Tara's an old friend. So yeah, I used to work with Tara back in the day, back when I was just a fledgling at Able Gamers myself. My name's Steve Spawn. I'm the Chief Operations Officer of Able Gamers. We're the world's largest charity helping people with disabilities play games by giving them the assistive technology that they need to be able to play the games when accessibility options aren't quite enough.
And James, go for it.
Yeah, I'm James Portnow. I'm a game designer by trade. I'm closing in on a decade now, and I've worked on things ranging from the Call of Duty series to Farmville. But most people know me as an animated bean person on the internet because I write a show called Extra Credits.
Awesome. So let's get started with what we're here to talk about today. The kind of the headline, as everyone can see up top, is accessibility in single player progression driven games. And I'm going to, unlike normally, I like to jump in and start talking to the panelists right away because they're all way smarter than me about this stuff. But I need to do some setup for us today, just so that everyone is on the same page about why I thought it was worth bringing these people on today. Um, this started a couple weeks ago when, after everyone was discussing an article that was bouncing around on Twitter, talking about why games aren't very good at storytelling, which is like a whole other panel that we could have another day about how people think about game storytelling. And I made a joke that, wow, when people talk about games should just dump story, it's like everyone starts stroking their beards or their metaphorical beards and going, yes, perhaps this is the way to go. Perhaps this is a better way to make games. And when people who work in the game industry suggest the reverse, they it doesn't go so well. People get harassed. I made this joke. It was like 8 in the morning, and I made this, and I thought no one would care. And a few thousand retweets later, I had a lot of responses in my feed actually going, "Oh my god, I would totally love an option to like skip combat in games so I could get to the story parts I like." And I was like, "Oh, that's like people want that." Not just for a large variety of reasons. The first of which jumped in my feed, was a lot of people saying it would be an accessibility aid for them. Um, Before we jump forward on discussing that subject and the implications it has, I do want to give credit to two other writers who actually like have written about and talked about that idea before. The idea of games of progression driven games where you can skip, and maybe the option to skip the combat. Those two writers are Jennifer Hepler, formerly of BioWare, and Max Batcher, who wrote an article about this on, I think, his blog back in 2015. I just want to give credit because I made that tweet. It got like 1,000 retweets, and I felt really guilty because I was like, I'm just pointing out something that other people have said. Um, and just to give some boundaries for the kind of games we're discussing today, and kind of the goal of the accessibility design we're talking about today, the kind of games I think people this resonates with them is for single or like cooperative experiences that are driven by progression and challenge, but have a lot of engineered content or authored content, or even sometimes like emergent content that's hidden behind that stuff. Like I'm playing Horizon Zero Dawn right now, and it goes without saying that you would not be able to learn more about the characters, see the places in the world, or see even some of the cool combat encounters if you're having trouble getting through ones that are earlier in the game. So this isn't quite so. This is neither about like multiplayer games. That's another discussion, and it's also not quite about games that are only the challenges, because that is also another discussion. So that's all the broad context. So In order from Tara to Steven to James, we're going to start off by asking, what do you think, just completely ignoring for a second all the technical and design challenges needed to implement it, because it's very hard, I'm aware, just about the idea of games like Dragon Age or Horizon Zero Dawn having an option where you could end a combat session and just move on to the story stuff if that combat session is proving too difficult for you. So Tara, you can go first.
So I'm actually not against that idea, but I think if you're doing a good job designing your game, it's probably not going to be needed. I think there are other options rather than a skip combat button. So I've worked on several narrative-driven games like The Order 1886 and Bioshock Infinite, and although there are definitely like flavors and fun in the combat, that's not really what either of those games are about. Like, you don't think of the Bioshock series and think, oh yeah, that combat was the strong suit. I mean, let's be honest, the combat in the original Bioshock was pretty terrible, but it's the narrative. But again, like, being able to launch bees at someone was part of the world crafting. So I think that there are probably other options you can use. So aside from the traditional, easy, medium, difficult, and that stuff, like, I think we should be offering other options to allow the player to adjust it as much as we needed. So, I've worked on games where we've played with the idea of basically like high velocity snap twos or like a snap to center when aiming, but also being able to do stuff like dipping the health of the characters that you're fighting. I think a lot of times there are story elements or environmental elements that are in these combats that we still want to give the player. So although I think, if you're frustrated, you should be able to skip it, I think there are probably other things we can do to let you get these other little hidden gems that we're probably still placing in the combat that are part of the overall narrative. So I think that, like I was saying, that there has to be something. I think that should be a last resort. I think there are probably other things we can do first, but I'm not against doing that. Like, if the options are doing all the stuff I just talked about or having a skip combat, or nothing, like, I would definitely rather take a skip combat button over doing nothing, if that makes sense.
Steve, what are your thoughts?
I don't think that it's necessary to skip combat in most cases, although I do think that for a game like Dragon Age, that having the option that when you engage in combat that you can fast roll the battle and let the AI resolve everything isn't necessarily a bad option. I think that if more games had not necessarily difficulty settings, but story modes where you can become a god character, where you can barely be hurt, or else you have to go AFK and make a sandwich in order to die, you really can get a flavor for the combat as well as for the story, and that also allows a lot of options. What Tara and I and James and those of us in the game accessibility field always advocate for is more options, never less. So for somebody who wants to go through the combat and they want to have that experience like they're there and they're actually fighting, they can do that. And if you're somebody who can't go through it, then I think you should have the same gaming experience just to enjoy the story. And if there's something in the combat, say possible loot drops or possible achievements, you should have some way of achieving those through a means that doesn't necessarily involve getting in the combat. But you can also limit the achievements so that people who are hardcore gamers don't feel slighted by not joining in the combat. There should be a balance between the two.
And James, go for it.
So on the technical side, because I actually think it is important that we think about the technical side, as Steve was mentioning, it's actually not very hard to enable these modes, because basically all you do is you take whatever AI is running your other characters, and you set the character's health and other stats to something bonkers, and then you have a button that you press to say AI take over, and your character, as they are, will sort of clear out the area, and what abilities, what other things you've given them will change how the combat effectively looks, right? Because the AI will be using those things. Mm-hmm. And so you don't have to necessarily miss all the environmental stuff, all the character building stuff out of the progression system that we've been utilizing. And I mean, I agree that additional options are always of value, because when we think about accessibility, there's just so many vectors and so many different types of people we can make this more accessible for. And when you were talking about this, I mean, honestly, I thought about my folks, right? My mom and dad never going to be able to play Dragon Age, never going to be able to play Bioshock. But this is something they want to share with me, and more importantly, with their grandkids who love video games, who are really excited to talk about them all the time, but they can't share with them because they just don't have the skills. They haven't built this thing. And so if you could have that moment where they could toggle on, hey, let the AI take over because this is something that if I'm controlling it, I'm just going to look towards the ground and spin a bunch. That would allow them access to this world. And I think that for cost, if we were at least doing the quick and dirty have AI take over way, there's not a lot of reason not to have that option somewhere in there.
Great. That's actually, I think James's point helps me springboard into my next question. And this one goes to Steve and Tara a little bit more because you've worked with able gamers, which means you've worked with the players who have asked for assistance in making sure that they can play the games that they enjoy. What are because I think this goes into physical and neurological disabilities. What are some of the reasons that a player might not be able to make it past, just for reference, like we keep going back to Dragon Age. What are the reasons that a player might not be able to make it through a Dragon Age encounter, or I'm playing Horizon Zero Dawn right now, one of those encounters? James, is that you?
No,
That
it's
ain't me.
okay. No, okay. So I have this amiibo holder that I swear to God is haunted. It's not supposed to go off unless you move something in it, and it just randomly goes off. So that was my Zelda amiibo deciding it was the right time to go off. I'm sorry.
It was correct.
Okay,
I was trying to play it cool, but it definitely got picked up by the mic.
I didn't think the question was that epic, but Steve and Tara, could you introduce why players might have challenges with these encounters to begin with?
So I haven't actually played Dragon Age, so I can't talk to Dragon Age, but I can talk to other games.
Right.
A lot of it has to do with a combination of a few different things, but with the gamers I've worked with, the most common ones are normally a combination of a few impairments. It could be something that like they don't have great reflexes because of something, and so just being able to work fast enough is sometimes a problem. Sometimes there's something where you can't hold a standard controller in the same way that I do, for example. Mm-hmm. So trying to find a way that you can use that controller and it work nicely with the game's controls is another really, really common problem. And I think like that's really a big part, and I always feel like a broken record for saying this, but there's so many times when like a gamer has already dumped money into a specialty controller, or someone like Able Gamers has helped them get a specialty controller, only to find that they're still struggling because there's not a nice marriage between this third-party item that they've gotten to help them game and the game itself, not allowing them to use it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so when you're talking about physical impairments, you're talking about the main body of people with disabilities in video games having problems. So you have a section that has visual disabilities and a section that has cognitive and hearing, but the main body, we estimate somewhere around 66%, is people who are anywhere between slightly disabled, having a small physical disability, like maybe you had an injury with missing a finger, or maybe some of your fingers don't quite work as well as they used to because of age. It's all the way up to a profound disability like a multiple sclerosis or a muscular dystrophy. These situations, you actually can't hold a controller, you can't use a controller, you probably can just look at it. It's not going to do anything for you. So that's when you're going to need assistive technology that can do almost everything for you. And like Tara was saying, what you choose to use, it completely depends on where you are right now. Is your prognosis going to get worse? Are you going to continue to spiral down the chain of muscular dystrophy and continue to lose abilities? Are you, recovering from a surgery? Do you only have one functioning arm? That all changes what the hardware needs to do to make up for the software. And that's why we continue to preach why so many options are needed, because this technology has to be able to reach an entire swath of people, up to 33 million gamers with disabilities in America alone.
Mm-hmm. That the question of hardware versus software then I think helps us springboard to the next subject. I think this is this is kind of a feel free to brainstorm and spitball kind of section where for Tara and James, in your experience, where are kind of the first places from the software end that you would think about trying to find ways to help those players make it through to the end of like a Dragon Age game or one of these single player games?
Yeah, so with me, the two things that I always go for first are number one, improving subtitles. That's incredibly important, especially in story-driven games. So many games today still have, I'm going to say, frankly, terrible subtitles. It's kind of atrocious. Almost every game has subtitles, but not very many games do subtitles well. But moving on from that, we were just talking about remappable controls. I mean, that's always one that I advocate for and I push for, and it's one of the first ones I try to get slotted. Because remappable controls, if you think about it from the beginning and kind of it's not hard, and you can easily build a system that works with it, especially if you're using like Unreal, for example. And having remappable controls can provide such a better experience. I'm even still kind of going back and forth with developers, so they'll be like, oh, but now the PS4 and the Xbox One, you can redo it system level. And I'm like, that's great, and it's a nice safety net, but it's still not a good experience. Like, if you do it at the system level, then it doesn't match any of your in-game UI. And now you've just introduced a whole other issue that's already confusing. And then normally, once you have remappable controls in, you can offer multiple control schemes. And then I really start going down that rabbit hole of how much are we going to let them tune their aim assist, their sensitivity. I want to give them southpaw. As far as I can go down the rabbit hole of custom controls, that's normally my first stop. And then it's also normally a good gauge on how open the team is going to be to me doing other things after that. So I tend to go over after controls first.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of want to throw in a curve onto this one, because you've got two of the best people out there to talk about accessibility in terms of physical issues. And you guys are amazing, and I want you to keep pressing this because this is so important. But I just want to raise here that there's a lot of other areas where games are not accessible to a lot of people. I mean, and even simple things like offering pronoun choice, right? Almost every game just defaults you to he or she, especially if it's not voice acted, or your main character, which we often have with our silent protagonist or whatever, is never referred to by that label. You can just have a quick flag and let people enter whatever pronoun they want. And there are plenty of people I know who sort of find it somewhat traumatic, find it inaccessible to have to approach games that don't represent who they are. And then on another front, right, one of the biggest accessibility problems in games is, especially single-player progression games, is the sticker price. I hate to say it, but we exclude literally tens, if not hundreds of millions of people by making $70 games, and that's only going up, right? And so I think that as a designer, it's also really important to think about not only questions of physical accessibility, which are essential, and we absolutely cannot sort of do what we've done for so long and just sort of think of as a side issue, but it's also time that we think about how can we make this accessible to people who may not be able to drop a couple $100s on a console, who may not be able to put in $70 every time they watch one of these experiences. Is there any way that we as companies can make this viable for ourselves without those upfront demands?
And I think that it's really important, the other thing kind of related to what you were just talking about is I hear all the time, that, accessibility can take up a lot of time, and that's not true. I have seen games come out of a game jam, right? And that's a free game that gets made in 3 days that people can play. So it's possible to do what you're talking about, to drop the prices, or to have games that are more affordable and still have them be accessible. I think it's really important to call out that those are not mutually exclusive.
Oh, no,
that
not
you can
at
have
all.
both.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely correct.
Yeah, I'm going to grab grab a question from the chat in just a moment, but I want to build off what James said in terms of accessibility by way of price, and which also actually I think overlaps with this thing we're talking about, like the idea that games have things that are worthwhile to experience, and people want to experience them, like certain things, but other things. There is the tendency for people to go ahead and record all those what I would call progression rewards, if you will. You know, things in a game that define that whole experience, and then upload them on YouTube. Um, and while some companies have seemed to have looked the other way on the copyright on those, I do know that a lot of developers get very frustrated when their whole game winds up on YouTube. But do you think there's a better way for game developers to take ownership of that little ad hoc practice and use that to help as some kind of either like basically use that as a metric for people are doing this, should we participate in this to help people see these parts of our game?
Do you guys mind if I jump in on this one just because I have a lot of knowledge of how YouTube actually functions technically?
Yeah.
Wait, you have knowledge on YouTube? I'm so surprised.
So the music industry already does this, right?
Yeah.
Like it's actually real easy. The way that music copyright claims work, this is total shorthand, but usually when you go to YouTube and you see a music, you listen to a piece of music that's not put up there by the publisher, by the copyright holder, they put a claim on it, and basically the person uploading it gets a percentage of the YouTube revenue, and a percentage of the revenue is automatically deferred to whatever major label that is. And I mean, we could do the same things. It's not the perfect answer for Let's Players because I know lots of people are struggling with revenue already. But if it was easy for Konami or Activision or whomever to just have an automatic thing rolling through and flagging, okay, this is our game, we get 20% of the revenue, but go nuts, right? Show as much of our game as you want. I think there's an easy middle ground that YouTube already has sort of the technical implementation for.
Yeah.
I also think that there's probably, obviously streaming games, with Twitch and Beam and YouTube and Facebook, like these are all really, really popular. And there are already some gamers who already experience games by another person playing it. Mm-hmm. And like, I don't have the answer, but I think there's probably, some way to encourage and utilize and foster these communities that are already doing it that way. Twitch integration is a thing now, and soon, partners are going to be able to even just sell games through the Twitch interface themselves. So, like, I think there's probably some avenue there as well that, game companies could better utilize.
I guess.
And also,
sorry,
it also speaks to the accessibility part, too. So, whether we're talking about financial or physical, if you're financially unable to access, let's say, a Dragon Age because it's $60 inside of your price range, you can go on to YouTube and you can watch almost the full story and you can experience it secondhand. Studies have shown that's not as good, it's not as fulfilling as doing it yourself, even if you only push a few buttons to do it. But at least you're enjoying the content that the developers have spent time to do. If they were to be able to get ad revenue from YouTube, if there was a way to make sure that the developers were compensated fairly for the work that they have created, then it's almost a win-win situation.
I'm going to I do enjoy this thread, but I'm going to share one thought and then move on to the questions from the wonderful people watching at home. I suppose in the near future it wouldn't be that unusual for a game company to sort of recruit people who could drive, I guess, streams of a game, and then and then essentially like use options like Twitch chat or APIs integrated with a game to help let people at home who couldn't physically navigate the controller experience the game and experience those story moments, and still making the kind of choices that we like to make in a single player game. Like whether it's a dialogue tree or an RPG or a tech tree. What the three of you said sort of dropped that idea in my head. To switch over to the chat, Lars, who is one of our frequent watchers and a frequent blogger on Gamasutra.com, would like to know how you all think that the Steam controller configurator software, if that is able to help out folks in situations like this, because the Steam controller obviously is super modifiable and doesn't even actually have any joysticks. and plus a couple extra buttons.
So,
Go ahead, James.
Good, James.
oh no, I was just throwing in because to fill silence. So if either of you guys have actually something smart to say,
Oh no, James,
you
good
guys-
James, go for it. Say the break the silence.
Oh no, I was actually now just saying words to buy us more time to think. But now I'm ready. So there's two things. One, I think that the Steam controller has some accessibility advantages, which you just mentioned. But I think that there's an issue that so many Steam games basically, I mean, yes, everything theoretically can utilize the Steam controller, but as Tara was bringing up earlier, since the makers of the games themselves aren't thinking about that piece of hardware at all, there are a lot of experiences which lose a great deal trying to play them on a Steam controller versus, say, a mouse and keyboard. Right.
I'm going to jump in with a brief clarification for Lars' sake. Lars is also asking about the Steam controller configurator software. I was confused by the question, which is the software for configuring any controller, not just Valve's controller.
Sure. I think that that's just a larger case of the case of the other controller. The other thing I was going to bring up is sort of, it kind of got mentioned earlier, but the co-op mode that we see on a lot of consoles that allow you to also configure multiple controllers for one game experience. So I can assign some things to the buttons on one controller and some things to the buttons on the other controller that I would normally use with either just a single mouse and keyboard or a single controller. Because being able to spread that stuff out, I have met lots of people who, depending on their different physical abilities, it's really helpful to be able to put a controller by their feet or under their chin and have another one that they can operate with a hand that has a little bit more mobility or whatever. And so if there are configurator options to let you spread out those controls over multiple devices as well, that's always super helpful.
And then Tara or Steve, did you want to jump in on that software?
Yeah, so let me answer the question sort of roundaboutly here. So any software that adds configuration adds to accessibility. It doesn't really matter what its base purpose is. It only matters that you can repurpose it. A lot of what Able Gamers does is taking software that was intended for one purpose and can be used for another. So take, for example, there is a software that works for games like Microsoft Flight Simulator that allow you to look around the cockpit and down on the ground, and you can virtually move your head around in order to get a better viewing experience like you're piloting a plane. We took that same software, repurposed it, and now we can make it where it pushes buttons in any game that you want. It doesn't have to be a SIM, it can just be any old game and it can push any old button. Same thing with the Steam configuration. It's allowing software to make devices do things, just as James said, in combination with other devices. Means that it's a more accessible experience because it lets it be configured to your particular set of needs, whether you're disabled or you're just able-bodied and need a certain set of comforts.
And Tara, do you have anything to throw in before I ask more questions?
No, I think they really covered it. I think like they were saying, the fact that you can configure, I mean, that's what's important, being able to adapt to technology to use it. And so I think they pretty much covered everything, I would say.
Right on. I am going to quickly switch over to another question from the chat. This one came in really early while we were still setting things up, so I couldn't get to it right away. iTalkGame asks what is potentially a thorny question, so I'm going to ask, just for everyone watching at home, if we can recall that we're all friends and we're all trying to enjoy games. How do you think about accessibility when not every game is geared towards the same demographic? They use the words hardcore versus casual. I would, just to approach where he's coming from, I would compare. I've been very broad in the games I've described today, like kind of story-driven games with adventures. But I would also guess he's talking about a game, like, in my head I'm thinking of Devil May Cry, which wants to turn up the difficulty in order for, like, because it wants players to be pushing buttons really fast. But I still I think there's room to discuss how games like Devil May Cry can still be accessible, though. So, do you all feel about the way those games are ranked?
So I think the most important thing to remember about accessibility is we're talking about removing unnecessary barriers.
Yeah.
So for example, if we're talking about Devil May Cry and the issue is trying to use your custom controller or additional technologies to help you play, Devil May Cry's designers, like, they didn't make the challenge of the game setting up your play space. Like, that was not what they intended. So I think we can't make every game accessible for everyone. I mean, I would love to say that we could, but there are so many challenges, and that's what part of a game is a challenge. But like, there are going to be barriers there that don't need to be there, and you need to find those and remove those. And there probably is something else with like these hardcore games, like a way to make them more accessible. And you know, earlier Steve was kind of commenting on like, you know, there are still ways that we can reward these hardcore players, but let other people maybe at the same like who can't play at that level, like let them enjoy the game too. So you have to find that balance. And like I said, like there are so many things that are just unneeded barriers from enjoying a game. And when we talk about accessibility, 9 out of 10 times, like those are the things that we're talking about to making games better.
Right. You don't have to. Actually, I will even go stronger language. It is not necessary to destroy a game in order for people with disabilities to enjoy the game. I can probably best describe this with a short anecdote. So, years ago, Able Gamers, myself, the founder, we were all invited to Rockstar's headquarters, Harmonix in Boston, Massachusetts. And we went in there, had a meeting with Alex
Rock Band?
Rock Band.
Just,
Yeah, Rock Band.
got it, yeah.
Well, yeah.
It sounded like you
Rock
went down
Band.
to San Diego to Rockstar HQ for a second.
I did that too. But we went to Rock Band at Harmonix headquarters, and when we had this meeting with him, we were talking to Alex about playing Rock Band and how you needed a minimum of 3 buttons in order to play the game, and that it's exceedingly hard to turn it from the console game into an assistive technology that the assistive technology can understand. And I asked him, why did you limit the buttons at 3? And he said, well, that was an arbitrary number. We just figured that no one would want to play our game if someone could only push 1 button. And I took a half a beat and looked at him in the face and I said, I would. Because I'm quadriplegic. That's why you don't see me animated on screen right now moving my arms around, because I can't. I would like to play Rock Band with only 1 button, and it would be fun to me to be able to play Rock Band with only 1 button, 1 input. And there are a lot of people out there that are in the same boat, where when we all think of games and we have more abilities, we think, well, I want to play Dark Souls, and I want to be able to beat the thing and not get killed, whereas somebody might just want to go through it in God mode so that they can complete the experience, so that they can have the same thing to talk about with their friends without having to impede on someone else who doesn't want those options.
I'm going to actually hijack the question now, because this is a great segue to something I linked in, which is partly why I invited James on today, because you brought up Dark Souls, and James, this is an Extra Credits episode that sat with me for a long time. You had an episode of covering Dark Souls 2, and how it has a difficulty interface that, even though, as we've talked about here, it would still mandate the need of a traditional controller, so it doesn't like solve it doesn't get rid of all the unnecessary barriers, but it does kind of create that something closer to that more open difficulty system that Steve was just talking about. Can you quickly do you remember that episode at all, or do I need to run through it? Because I was like, wait, you've probably written a lot of episodes.
Oh my god, it's like 400, maybe it's more than that now.
Yeah.
Don't remind me how old I am.
Do you need me to recap it? I can do it real quick.
So, no, I can. It was actually probably going to be my answer to the previous question as well. And there are 2 sides. There's one thing I want to jump back to on the previous question, but really that episode is sort of about the fact that a good hardcore game, like the hardcore games that get big, usually actually have hidden mechanics to sort of personally set the difficulty for yourself. Mm-hmm. Dark Souls is a great example because every single boss, if you want, you can phone a friend, right? Like, you can summon people to help you. And even if you're not connected to the internet, you can summon AI to help you. That dramatically reduces the difficulty of the bosses. Mm-hmm. And has a bunch of mechanics like that. If you choose to play range, you don't have to play the game at the same, like, high speed pace that the melee combat will take, especially if you're just sitting there sniping with magic or range stuff. And so there's all these built-in systems, and that's harder to do as a designer. That takes quality design. But for really good hardcore games, they do include a group of systems that will allow the players to sort of dynamically adjust the difficulty for themselves within the mechanics and systems of the game, not a menu setting, which I think is awesome, and I would love to see more games do. The other thing I just wanted to really quick respond to the last one, which was sort of also to Steven's point, was I was at a Street Fighter tournament relatively recently, and I mean, I'm not a good Street Fighter player. I 100% will give you that. But this kid rolls up in a wheelchair, and he's right. He's got a custom controller, and his hands don't he doesn't have as much mobility in his hands as I do. Crushes me, right? Destroys me. So this idea that accessibility is about making games easier, or that people with different physical abilities cannot be as hardcore or cannot be as good at games as people who have a full range of mobility, that's some bullshit. That's just not true. And it may be more difficult, 100%, but just saying you'll never get here. And so I want to totally agree with Tara that so much of this accessibility is giving people options to make the game playable for themselves and not necessarily even reducing difficulty overall.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question. I hate to drag this back to Dark Souls 2.
Oh no, I love it. Let's go.
Yeah,
that's where I want to live. So.
Ask James to talk about Dark Souls. Is it a day that ends in Y? I want to ask, because what I think, the reason why I really wanted to bring this episode up, and as James just mentioned, the in-game play systems to ease difficulty or increase it, is I finished this episode, and the first thought I had was, that is awesome that those systems exist. Are those systems clearly communicated as being able to fill that role? Do you think there's a way that designers can build those systems into games and sort of communicate to players, hey, if you are having, for whatever reason, if there's this kind of limit in the way of your ability to finish the game, you can turn to this system as opposed to turning to a menu to solve this problem? Because I think that was the only hole I wanted to poke in the script for that episode, which I know you guys are trying to write 6-minute episodes. You can't cover everything, so that wasn't what I was going for. But that was the first thought that came to mind: is how can not only these system designers think about these systems, but also let players know that this is a way to temper the experience like that.
That's much tougher. You're absolutely right? It's a really good point. And I mean, some of it relies on our sort of literacy as players and understanding of games. That's an area that it's much harder to balance the hardcore, because anything that you tell them is a mechanic to make it easier is going to get some backlash. But do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, my bad. Go ahead.
Okay. So I think what's important to realize about Dark Souls as an example is a lot of so my favorite thing to do in the world is just take the thoughts that my friend Ian Hamilton has and then steal them. So
could you just for those at home who maybe have not played Dark Souls, could you just 30-second explanation of what you just meant?
Okay. So basically, one of the things that happens in Dark Souls, it's about persistence and finding things, and that's part of the core game mechanics. So I think trying to make it more obvious is one of the things where it's kind of it's not about the difficulty in Dark Souls. It's about your ability to keep pushing through everything that's happening, learning as you get killed again and again and again.
Yeah.
So I think kind of we were just talking about anytime we would tell you this is how that works, I think it's kind of going against the original design of the game, which we don't want to destroy the design, but I think there's probably you're also going to encounter issues there because so for example I hate playing range stuff. I always want to be a melee person. I want to get up in their face and that's an example of a way that you can have an easier experience in Dark Souls is to play further back and, kind of kite the AI as needed. And like, I don't want to do that. So like, I may never find that out because that's just not how I want to play. So like, even that's not a perfect system. And then like, and that's on top of like educating people about it. So it's messy. I can understand why like he can't fit everything about this in a 6-minute YouTube video.
Right. The biggest problem is perception, and it is one of the biggest challenges that I and every other accessibility expert faces in changing the perception of the game industry. Although the gaming community is amazing, and all of the funding from Able Gamers comes from players who just want other players to be able to play games. They are beautiful souls who just care about other people. There are segments of the internet, segments of the darkness of humanity that don't care. They do not care about other people playing. They want their own experience. When Tara was back with Able Gamers, we went to GDC and we asked a simple question to developers. Have you ever thought about gamers with disabilities? Most everybody who answered it, you can go look it up on YouTube, said no. One person laughed at us and walked away. There are always going to be people who are heartless and cruel, and they do not care if those accessibility options would help a certain segment of the community. They only care that it might make the game a little bit cheaper, and therefore they can't be on their high horse. I beat Dark Souls, and it's hard as F, and therefore I'm an amazing player. So, we have to, as a community, come together and practice empathy and sympathy, and remember that we all want a game, and we all want to enjoy the game the best we can. However, that feels good to us.
And it is a very, very touchy subject. A couple of years ago, I did a GDC talk about just simple things you could do in terms of accessibility. And they actually had to disable the comments on the video because people were literally accusing me of ruining video games. And I was just trying to talk about accessibility. So it can get it can get harsh for, it's very intimidating sometimes.
But I think that a key word was brought up, right? Community. Because, that's what I love about games is this community and this idea of community. And yes, there are a lot of terrible people on the fringes of this. And yes, there are a lot of developers who may or may not fall into that category. But there's also a way we can think about this as a community, right? If I'm working on a game like Dark Souls as a designer, I should be reaching out to Able Gamers and saying, hey, look, I can't put this in my game, but the game doesn't exist by itself anymore. In the world of the internet, in the connected world we have today, let me write a guide for you, right, that talks about all the places where you may be able, within the mechanics, to adjust the difficulty, and you guys put it up, and it'll appeal to your community, right? And that's how I, as a developer, and this is one thing that I think we have to do more, having developers and the community work together more on this and have more of a channel between the two. But developers reaching out to people like Able Gamers and saying, hey, I can't say this in the game, but I'm happy to tell you guys about it, and you can tell the world, right?
I like that approach.
It's a great approach, and I wish more developers would, and we do work with all the big developers now, and James is 3,000% correct that there are ways around the system. At the same time, I do love when a studio will stand up against the haters and say, look, there is an acceptable way to do this. Studios don't put quote-unquote accessibility menus into games often because when they do, they get flack from the community. Well, I don't need an accessibility option, so why is that in the game? Why'd you spend time and money on it? You could have made this other thing better. And they don't think about the other repercussions of not doing that. But if we were to have these options in games and have studios stand up, then we'd have a better community. 15-second anecdote. When Call of Duty Infinite Wars came out, they went back to the jump packs. And I hate jump packs because they add an extra axis of shooting, and for somebody like me that has a slower reaction time and more difficulty aiming, doing so is annoying, and I hate it. And I went on Twitter and I talked about how, man, here we go again with the stupid jump packs, and we have to fly across the universe. Why can't we get back to staying on the ground? And I got lit up by a lot of people who were saying, that's stupid, you want to take jumping out of games. And I said, no. All I want is a game that doesn't require double jumping for jetpacks. It's where Call of Duty came from. I'd like to see it go back there. And developers from the game actually started arguing against the people that were coming after me with some really choice language, saying that I was stupid for the game. And they were saying, look, we want to make those kind of games too. This game has jump packs. Maybe the next one won't. You just have to wait for that to come around. So I think there's people on both sides, but I think we can come together and we can make that community stronger.
But I think that, when a studio does stand up for accessibility and they start talking about it. So when I was at Turtle Rock Studios, we made a lot of changes to Evolve to make it more accessible, and we dedicated our time to sharing that message. Like, we had a 30-minute segment on our weekly live stream that we just talked about accessibility and the accessibility features we were doing and why they were important. We had a section in our forums on accessibility. We opened up an avenue for communication that if you needed something, you could talk to us. And what was really great was, I always say we developed our own little accessibility army, because now there's a whole group of gamers who learned from us and now are teaching other people about accessibility. And like, when I say that they were our own little army, like, so earlier this year there was the first game accessibility conference called GA Conf that was the Monday before GDC, and me and my friend who's the community marketing manager for Turtle Rock, we managed to raise money that we got just from gamers to be a sponsor. So we call ourselves Shara, Shane, and Tara, and Shara was a sponsor. And that just literally came from the gamers who watched us and us saying, we think this is important. We want to put money towards this cause. And the community just gave us money to help. So I think, earlier, Steve was talking about, sympathy and empathy. And once you educate the public, when you as a studio take a stance and teach people why you're doing something, like 9 out of 10 times, like, the gamers will get it. I mean, we're gamers, we want to game, we want to help other people game, and like you said, once you tap into that empathy and you understand, like, you enjoyed this, but right now some other people can't, they'll help you and they'll want to share that information too.
I am going to really briefly quick address, because I think everyone, Steve, James, and I jumped to the chat real quick for the same reason. There are some folks in the chat who are asking for some quick practical tips about implementing accessibility features. I'm going to refer them mostly to some of the talks on the GDC Vault, including Tara's talks about Evolve, and you had a general accessibility guide from a couple years ago, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I'll link those in just a second after I ask my next question, which...
Can I put an additive in there as well?
Go for it. Go for it, Steve.
So also, Able Gamers has the Practical Game Accessibility Guide, which you can go to at includification.com. It's free, 50 pages for developers to design a practical game accessibility game.
Awesome. I'm going to ask, because I like I have a curiosity about specific things that can be implemented myself. I'm kind of curious about how you all would think about maybe one of the biggest things that really sucks when you're struggling with a game and can often provide a negative experience is the game over state, like the fail state of a game, right? We came here today to talk about games that when all your numbers drop down, the game sort of flashes a screen at you and says, go back. And that's often just a negative reinforcement that sort of gets you to, makes you want to think about how you can improve the experience a bit. So do you all have any kind of opinions or thoughts about how that part of the gameplay loop could be used to kind of be more, use that specific moment to make a game more accessible?
I think there are a lot of games that have soft fails that I think really help. I think actually a really good example of this is Zelda Breath of the Wild. Mm-hmm. So sure, you can just die and then that sucks, but you get to restart. But they have other ways that you can be in game and do stuff that would have incurred the same penalty, but you don't die. So you can go pick up a bunch of fairies, and then when you're down, all of a sudden a fairy brings you back. Like, if you didn't have that fairy, you just would have died. Mm-hmm. And the same thing with Mipha's Grace, instead of, it's basically like, oops, you would have died, but I'm here, you're better. So I think having more kind of soft fails like that really make things better. I'm a total, when I play games, like games that have permadeath where you lose stuff, like, I freak out. like I don't do well with it. Even like weapon degradation, I'm not great with.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's why I'm such a fan of like soft fails, because I hate losing my stuff. But I think like that idea of giving the player an avenue to retry that's not necessarily a like, wow, you suck, you know, giant text that says you're dead. I mean, granted, sometimes that's like great. Like I couldn't imagine a Resident Evil where it didn't splash like bloody text that said you're dead, but that's not for every game.
And sometimes it can just be recontextualizing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and that can literally be as simple as text, right? Most of the times you have game over or you lose. If it said you've fallen, but next time you may conquer, right? Like next time you may succeed. If it's something that is that when you lose, it inspires you to try again. I think that's a huge thing for all of us, because that's a value, regardless of who you are, that we want to instill, that you get back up and you do it again, and eventually you'll overcome this thing that has bested you so many times.
Yeah, I love fail-safes. Fail-safes are something we talk about in the includification guide. They're an important part of gaming. I understand why games like Dark Souls avoid that kind of fail-safes, but when it's easy. I'm saying easy, but it's relatively easy as a developer to put in rubber banding, where if you fail at a challenge 6 or 7 times, an option pops up and the game goes, hey, this looks like it's really hard. You want me to maybe give you a hint or maybe make it a little bit easier for you? It doesn't have to be demoralizing and it doesn't have to be embarrassing. It can be a helping hand if we let it be.
Yeah. Thank you all for your thoughts on that. It is time. We're getting in on the end of the hour here. So before we begin any wrap up stuff, I'm just gonna throw it out to the chat. If you have any questions for Tara, Steven, and James, preferably accessibility related. If you want to get James's tips for beating Dark Souls, be careful, because then we'll be here for another hour. But if you have any questions, throw them out now and I'll grab them. And I guess how my personal last question, and then we'll get the ones from the chat, is because to bring this all back to that first skip combat button, is if you could sort of have, thinking about the root of that problem, what's kind of your favorite thing you would start thinking about if you got that feedback on your game that players wanted to skip like combat sections to get to the story bits? What's the first thing you would start working on if it was your studio and your team?
Well, the first thing I would start working on is being super happy that people love the story, and being like, well, maybe that's where we should focus, right? I mean, if I get feedback to the point where people are like, the combat is getting in the way of the story, that's actually an awesome thing. And then beyond that, it's fairly easy right now to make some of that feel cinematic, even if you're having the AI run, right? Mm-hmm. To have it feel like the character, and especially to just do some little tweaks to the AI to make sure that it's using all the abilities that you've put in through the progression, so they get to experience, so it still feels like the character they've built. But I might even think about, in the sequel or whatever, focusing more on interactivity in non-combat sections, right? Mm-hmm. And because if that's where people want to be, then that's what we should be doing.
Tara, go ahead.
I think if I had to start working on, like, I would, I honestly, like, the first thing I would probably do is, like, dive into some sort of, like, user research session, mm-hmm. and, like, watch to figure out what is causing the struggle. Because as I mentioned earlier, sometimes you're putting little, like, environmental pieces of story in the combat, and so I would want to see, like, what is it that's causing the problem for these guys? Like, are there too many people? Is it something with my controls? Like, I would honestly just start researching, so that I would be able to, find out what I need to provide them to be able to play. I think that, that's it. That's my answer. I think that I would probably just start researching, because I would want to understand what's happening, because I think the best way to solve a problem is to truly understand the problem. So I would want to know, what is it about the combat that's, preventing them from finishing it.
Steve, I'm going to tweak the question for you. I'm going to ask, if someone came to your organization and said, and I'm being because the problem is they might come to you with a number of different disabilities.
Right.
It's hard to give a specific answer, but I am curious when someone comes to you says, I'm playing Dragon Age and I really want to see more of the story, but this combat is too hard. What does your organization start thinking about?
Well, immediately we figure out whether or not the game has difficulty settings and whether or not it has a god mode, and then we will suggest PC, and then we'll start looking into cheats and then figuring out ways to circumvent what the devs wanted. And that's, a shame that we sometimes have to do that, but if somebody wants to experience the game and they can't play it because it's too difficult, sometimes you have to rely on external means of making the game playable.
Yeah. Thank you for actually. I mean, I think developers can appreciate the bluntness there, because I think it helps them to know that you have to just start breaking the game.
I would love to get into the legal question that was asked if we have 3 minutes to tackle it.
Which is it? A legal question from the chat?
Yeah.
Go ahead, and then I'll grab the question that I had.
Okay. So, in the chat earlier, they were asking how all of us felt about demos and piracy, and can piracy be used in accessibility? And the true answer that I've run by a lot of devs, and very few of them have problems with, is that piracy is an unfortunate result of companies beginning to eliminate demos from downloads. You used to be able to get demos from everything, from on Steam to regular console games, and you could find out if you can play the game or not. That's why we started doing reviews, because demos went away. So if you have to pirate a game in order to see if it's accessible, then personally, I see some legal problems with that, and I can't say you should do it, but if you have to do what you have to do to find out if a game is accessible because there's no reviews about it online, then do what you got to do. My only point to that is, if you're going to pirate a game and you're going to use it because you can play it, buy the copy of the game and support the developers. Just because you needed to find a way to play it doesn't mean that you should steal. There's a difference between playing the game and finding out if you can, or just abusing a system. So I think you could do both. And I think we can get around the legal ramifications by saying, hey, I just needed to see if I could play it. But now I paid for it, so we're all good.
I will briefly disclose, so that my boss doesn't kill me, that the Gamasutra does not in any way endorse illegal activity. I hope that goes without saying. I will let Steven's opinion stand for itself. I have to do that just so that certain people don't yell at me. I would love to. What was that?
Real quick thing that I actually just recommended to a medium-sized developer. So I'm a big fan of pay what you want schemes, right? Like, we've seen Humble Bundle be so valuable for so many developers, and I think that helps accessibility. So I actually was just working with somebody, and they were asking about like piracy and what do we do. I was like, look, it's going to get on the torrents anyway, so just upload a version yourself, and then have points in the game where it pops up a link or an option to pay you guys whatever they think it's worth, right? And I think that as developers, sometimes utilizing those piracy structures and saying, look, we're not blaming you, but we need to eat, and becoming human beings to your pirates rather than just becoming antagonists, will see you more revenue, right? And allow people to do things like see if they can play the game.
That's a good thought. I would, again, these are questions
Right,
I would love to spend more time on.
Yeah.
But I got a guy standing over here with like pointing at his watch. Also, he's like got horns. That's scary. The last question I'll grab from Dagger's Oath in the chat is, if there's a game that developers, like say developers want to start working on this, what game should they look at to start looking at options that will help make their games more accessible? One game for each of you. And the cat. The cat can have a game too.
Yeah, he has really been a fan of this chat and sticking his tail on my mouth. It's been great. I think that a really good example that's out right now, is Uncharted 4. It's an awesome AAA title that's fun, and it has accessibility features in that allow for so many people to play the title, and they even present it up front. And I think it's a really good example that like you can have these features in your game and it still be a AAA award-winning title, and that it's not going to take away from anything else. So I think if you want to learn, you can just go there, and like they make it look so easy. So I think, oh my gosh, Leon, like get out of. I guess that means Leon agrees or disagrees. I'm not sure.
Steve, do you have an answer?
So I think that what Naughty Dog did with Uncharted is great because it helped a lot of people. I think that in the a lot of what's not talked about there is that it was not a game that was made accessible to all. There are still people that cannot play it. And a lot of times when I've seen it in the press talked about how Naughty Dog made this accessible game, they did improve it and they did get some help making it more accessible, but it's not accessible to everyone. And we need to remember that you're never going to make a game that's accessible to everyone. It's not something that's going to happen. All you can do is make it the best you can. So when World of Warcraft implemented the ability to change the color scheme to whatever you need it to be so you can see what's in front of you and fight it appropriately, that was a big help to some people. When they added the ability to use your mouse to play the entire game, both things that Able Gamers was privileged to help with, we were able to help a large swath of people. But there are still people who come to us and say, we can't play World of Warcraft. So, we could sit here and name games all day that are good examples, but there is no shining example that will be good for everybody. It's good for certain demographics.
James, I hate to make you follow up on that.
So my two answers were Uncharted and World of Warcraft.
Good game, I win. We're done.
Yeah, accessibility, done. I'm trying to think because, like, again, I'm just going to raise the other things, and just things like having having things like Humble Bundle, right, that allow people to access these games at a lower price. Or I've seen some companies now that have started to donate, because it's tax write-off, they donate like 7,000, 8,000 copies of their games to libraries across the U.S., right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to see it across the world. And so just things like that also allow people who might be in youth shelters would be another great place to send this to. And so I will jump back the other route of accessibility and say I would also love to see more of that. And curse you guys for stealing my answers.
Yeah.
But it's awesome doing this with you guys, by the way. Thank you so much for having me on this.
Yeah.
No, I'm excited. So I was just like, oh my gosh, extra credits. I've been watching that for forever.
That was actually my reaction when I first interviewed James on Skype years ago. So,
I remember.
from Skype to Skype, from ashes to ash to ash, dust to dust. I will then begin wrapping things up. Thank you all for joining us again. If you're watching at home, this has been the Gamasutra Twitch channel, and today we have been talking about game accessibility and accessibility in progression-driven games. If you just tuned in, I'm going to get this video will be archived on Twitch, and I'm going to get it onto YouTube so that the subtitles function will be working there. If you appreciated this talk and want to talk to more developers about how they got their game made, we would appreciate it if you scrolled down and clicked the follow button, because we've got more developer interviews set up for this week and next week and beyond. E3 is coming up, so we're going to be talking about some of the developer implications of what's going to be announced at E3. And aside from that, Tara, Steven, and James, is there anywhere you would like people, if say they have follow-up questions or they just want to follow you on social media or whatever, where would you send them?
Okay, I'll go first. So you can always just hit me up on Twitter. It's Lady Au Pair, which is LADIEAUPAIR. It's my old gamer tag. It's a Venture Brothers reference that none of the kids get today. But that's where you can find me. Just, shoot me a message on Twitter, and I will answer anything you have.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm nowhere near as famous as James, but you can follow me on Twitter at Steven Spawn. I answer any questions you guys need, and please give a follow and like to Able Gamers on Facebook and Twitter. You can find us on any platform except for Snapchat. We're under Able Gamers, and we'll be happy to help you out whatever you need.
And I'm terrible. I'm always jetting around the world, like, and I realized years ago that Twitter was eating too many hours of my day. So for me, just come hang out in the Extra Credits comments because I actually do read basically all of them. And yeah, just push this discussion because it's awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Hope you all have a great day. Bye.
Bye.